Okay, let's get to the lumber sector. It's been a rough year for Canadian forest companies. U.S. tariffs.
Now taking a look at one of the top stories today in our country, Canadian lumber is taking another hit from U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war. New tariffs announced last month.
A tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such, and yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Something significant is unfolding beneath the surface of the North American housing market, and most families will not fully understand it until they see it reflected in the price of their next home. Lumber costs are rising again, builders are slowing projects, and Canada, long the largest foreign supplier of softwood lumber to the United States, has quietly reshaped its entire industry in response to tariffs. What started as a trade dispute has evolved into a structural supply shift, one that is tightening American construction from multiple angles and adding new pressure to an already fragile housing system. The turning point came when President Donald Trump imposed steep tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, with rates ranging from roughly 35% to nearly 47% depending on the producer. The objective was straightforward: protect American lumber mills and pressure Canada into more favorable trade terms. Companies like Canfor faced tariffs above 47%, while others, such as West Fraser, were hit with rates exceeding 26%. These were not symbolic measures. They were designed to make Canadian lumber significantly less competitive in the U.S. market. For decades, American home builders depended on Canadian imports to help balance domestic supply gaps. The United States consumes about 70 billion board feet of lumber annually, while domestic production typically sits closer to 58 billion. That leaves a structural gap of roughly 12 billion board feet each year. Canadian imports historically filled much of that shortfall, stabilizing prices and ensuring steady construction flow. Instead of negotiating minor tariff adjustments, Canada pivoted strategically.
Father talked about his first house that he bought was $80,000, which is now my down payment.
Prime Minister Mark Carney launched a $5 billion restructuring plan aimed at permanently reducing reliance on U.S. buyers. The centerpiece was a Buy Canada mandate applied to federal procurement. Government infrastructure projects, public housing, military facilities, and federal buildings were required to prioritize Canadian lumber, even if imported wood cost less. That single policy redirected billions of dollars in demand back into domestic mills. Financial support reinforced the shift. The Business Development Bank of Canada expanded loan programs offering between $2 and $5 million to lumber producers affected by tariffs. Larger companies gained access to broader credit facilities. Provinces added their own programs. Ontario invested in forest infrastructure and processing upgrades. British Columbia created manufacturing job support funds. Prairie provinces launched complementary initiatives. This was coordinated restructuring, not short-term relief. The transition was painful. More than 20 mills closed permanently. Thousands of workers lost jobs. Dozens of facilities reduced output. But surviving companies emerged leaner, more efficient, and supported by guaranteed domestic demand through government contracts. And those government loans were not grants. They must be repaid. That means higher lumber pricing became part of the recovery model. Canadian mills no longer needed to chase heavily tariffed U.S. buyers when they could sell domestically at stable, elevated prices or redirect exports overseas. Export diversification accelerated quickly. British Columbia began shifting a portion of its lumber shipments toward Europe, including the United Kingdom. Scandinavian countries traditionally dominate that market, but supply constraints and geopolitical shifts opened space for Canadian volume. Even with shipping costs included, avoiding steep U.S. tariffs made European markets economically viable. Asia also emerged as a growing destination. Japan and South Korea became priority markets, supported by Pacific port infrastructure. Canadian mills invested in new equipment to meet Asian grading standards. Once these trade routes solidified, long-term contracts followed. And once supply chains adapt, they rarely reverse easily. Meanwhile, American builders felt the squeeze. Framing lumber prices surged sharply before settling into a higher average range than builders were accustomed to. Supply tightening rather than a construction boom drove much of the volatility. The Canadian volume that once helped stabilize U.S. markets was being absorbed domestically or shipped overseas. American mills benefited from reduced competition and stronger margins, but they could not instantly expand production to replace Canada's scale. Housing affordability sits at the center of this shift. The United States faces a housing shortage estimated at more than 4 million homes. Annual housing starts remain below the level needed to close that gap over the next decade. Builders already confront labor shortages, zoning restrictions, and financing challenges. Lumber accounts for roughly 15 to 25% of the materials cost of building a typical single-family home. When prices climb significantly, thousands of dollars are added to construction costs. Estimates suggest tariffs and supply adjustments can add around $6,000 or more to the cost of a new home. In tight lending conditions, that increase can push many buyers out of mortgage qualification ranges. Even modest material cost increases ripple through final pricing. While American policymakers debated affordability solutions, Canada solidified its domestic alignment. Government procurement guarantees steady demand. Infrastructure upgrades improve efficiency. Corporate consolidation strengthened larger producers. Automation increased productivity. The Canadian lumber industry emerged smaller in workforce, but more strategically focused and globally diversified. The irony is difficult to ignore. Tariffs intended to strengthen American lumber producers pushed Canada to restructure for independence. U.S. mills gained pricing power, yet builders face constrained supply and elevated costs. The housing shortage deepens when construction slows due to material expenses. Rent pressures rise when new homes fail to enter the market quickly enough. Canadian lumber heading to London or Tokyo will not automatically reroute back to Seattle or Los Angeles. Trade relationships built under pressure often become permanent. Mills prefer stable, predictable markets over ones vulnerable to policy swings. For American households, the consequences are practical rather than political. Higher construction costs translate into higher home prices. Entry-level housing becomes harder to finance. Renters remain renters longer. Young families delay ownership. Canada absorbed short-term disruption but emerged with a diversified export base and reduced reliance on a single buyer. $5 billion in restructuring reshaped procurement rules, financing mechanisms, and global trade direction. The Buy Canada framework remains in place. Export partnerships with Europe and Asia continue expanding. The United States now faces a complex question. Can domestic production expand quickly enough to close the 12 billion board-foot supply gap? Environmental permitting, labor availability, and capital investment timelines make rapid scaling difficult. Meanwhile, the housing deficit grows. Trade policy often aims to protect industries, but when tariffs target essential construction materials, the costs reach far beyond lumber companies. They shape housing markets, community growth, and long-term affordability. President Trump imposed tariffs believing they would strengthen American producers. Prime Minister Carney responded with a restructuring strategy that reduced Canada's dependence on U.S. demand and expanded its global footprint. Both sides pursued national objectives, yet the housing market now carries the long-term consequences. North American lumber supply has shifted structurally, not temporarily, and until domestic production fully replaces lost imports or trade tensions ease significantly, American builders and homebuyers will continue feeling the effects of a dispute that began at the border but now stretches deep into every new foundation poured across the country.